Have you ever wondered how a civilization so old could still feel so vivid, so close, and so full of small surprises? Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we'll spend some unhurried time with ancient Egypt, not as a grand parade of kings and monuments, but as a place of daily routines, odd customs, clever inventions, and quiet details that still feel surprisingly human. If you enjoy these calm late-night journeys, you can like or subscribe if that feels right for you, and you're always welcome to leave a gentle comment about where you're listening from tonight, or what quiet subject you might like to wander into next. Now let the room grow softer around you. Let your thoughts slow down a little. Imagine warm stone, shaded courtyards, the slow bend of the Nile, and the kind of evening that seems to hold its breath. From there, we can begin very simply, with the world itself and with the people who lived inside it. Ancient Egypt was, in many ways, a civilization built around a dependable rhythm. The Nile rose, the fields were nourished, and life followed the water with a kind of patient confidence. That alone is a small wonder, because it means so much of Egyptian life was shaped by something steady enough to trust, yet powerful enough to command respect. If you picture ancient people as always living in dramatic moments, it is comforting to remember how much of life was ordinary. People woke up, ate, worked, repaired, carried, fetched, counted, cleaned, and waited. They did these things beside one of the most famous rivers in the world, but their days still had the familiar texture of routine. The Nile was not just scenery. It was a road, a calendar, a source of soil, and a quiet guide. Boats moved with the current, and sailcloth caught the wind in the other direction. In a land where the river mattered so much, even travel could feel like a conversation with the landscape. One direction was easier, another direction asked more patience, and the river itself remained the same. The river also gave Egypt its long shape, narrow and stretched, a green ribbon bordered by desert. That contrast is one of the simplest and most striking features of the country. On one side, life clustered near the water. On the other, the desert waited with its dry silence. The edge between the two must have felt important every single day. And because the land was so centered on the river, the seasons carried meaning too. The annual flooding was not a mystery in the modern sense, but it was still something people watched closely. Too little water could mean hardship. Too much could make life difficult in another way. So the Egyptians learned to live with timing, measurement, and careful observation. They looked, they remembered, and they adjusted. That practical attention gave Egyptian civilization a special character. It was not careless, and it was not dreamy in a detached way. It was observant, it noticed patterns, it respected order. Many of the strange and impressive things we remember about Egypt, from writing to architecture to religion, grew from a culture that understood the value of keeping track. Even the idea of order itself was important. The Egyptians had a word often translated as ma'at, a concept that included balance, truth, harmony, and proper arrangement. It sounds lofty, but it also lived inside ordinary life. A straight wall, a careful record, a fair exchange, a stable season, a cleanly prepared tomb, a properly wrapped body, a measured field, a name spoken correctly, all of these belonged in that world of order. So when we think about ancient Egypt, it helps to begin not with treasure, but with attention. Attention to water, attention to time, attention to work, attention to the way things fit together. A civilization can seem grand from far away, yet still be made from patient daily habits. And there were many small habits, some so practical they can feel almost modern. Egyptians used makeup, for example, not only for beauty but also for the eyes, since dark pigments like kohl could help shield the face from the glare of the sun. That is a very human idea, elegant and useful at the same time. They wanted to look refined, certainly, but they also wanted comfort and protection. Perfume mattered too. Oils and scents were part of grooming, ceremony, and status. In a warm climate, fragrance could be pleasant, but it could also suggest care, refinement, and cleanliness. The body was not treated as something meaningless. It was cared for, dressed, anointed, and presented. Even the simplest personal rituals could carry dignity. Clothing, too, reflects this sense of practical grace. Linen was especially valued because it breathed well in the heat. White garments are often associated with Egyptian imagery, and there is good reason for that. Linen could be washed, beaten, folded, and worn in ways that suited the climate. A person's clothing was not just an ornament, it was part of living successfully in a bright, dry land. And still, despite all that order, ancient Egypt never feels entirely predictable. It holds surprises at every turn. A civilization so known for tombs and temples was also full of bread, beer, baskets, sandals, fish, tools, household gods, children, games, and scraps of writing. It was a living place, not a museum of stone. If you imagine one evening in an Egyptian home, it might have been very simple. Perhaps someone was grinding grain, someone else was mending a garment, a child was being told to stay out of the way. Outside, the light would be turning gold and low. Inside, the air might smell of bread dough, reed mats, and dust warmed by the sun. Nothing dramatic would need to happen for the moment to be memorable. That quiet normality is worth lingering on because it softens the common image of ancient history. Not every moment was a ceremony. Not every building was a temple. Not every person was a pharaoh. Most people lived in the spaces between the famous things, and those spaces were full of life. Even the houses themselves were often made from materials that remind us of this everyday quality. Mud brick was common, and it made sense for the climate and available resources. Mud brick does not last as long as stone, which is why so much of the grand image of Egypt comes from monumental structures rather than ordinary homes. But for the people who lived there, those houses were shelter, shade, storage, and family space. A home could have a courtyard, a roof area, rooms for work, and spaces for sleeping as the temperature changed through the day. People adapted constantly. They did not need modern language to understand airflow, shade, and practical design. They simply knew what helped. Many of the small objects found from ancient Egypt seem to preserve that same useful intelligence. Loom weights, combs, mirrors, grinding stones, jars, spoons, and weaving tools all suggest hands busy with repeated tasks. There is something soothing in that. A civilization can be studied through kings and battles, but it can also be understood through the shape of a spoon, the wear on a basket, or the careful edge of a stone tool. And then there is writing, one of the greatest quiet wonders of Egypt. Hieroglyphs often look ceremonial to modern eyes, but writing in Egypt was not only decorative. It was administrative, religious, personal, and practical. It kept track of offerings, taxes, names, prayers, and property. It turned spoken life into something that could be counted, preserved, and repeated. The Egyptians also used more streamlined scripts for daily writing, because a civilization that writes a lot eventually needs convenience. That detail is easy to appreciate. No culture creates a monumental script and then uses it only for monuments. Writing must serve the working world too. And yet, even in this practical environment, the written word retained a kind of sacred weight. To write a name was important, to remember a person was important, to speak or inscribe something correctly was important. A name could outlast a body, a phrase could be repeated for centuries, so writing became a bridge between the temporary and the lasting. That is one reason the ancient Egyptians continue to feel so near. Their objects still speak, their walls still carry names, their tombs still hold images of bread, birds, boats, tools, and offerings. The ancient world often seems far away until you notice how much it cared about the same things people care about now: food, identity, memory, safety, beauty, and the wish not to be forgotten too quickly. In the evenings, when the light softened across the land, the river might have reflected the sky with an almost sleepy brightness. The air would cool a little. Shadows would lengthen beside the walls and palms. And somewhere in that quiet, someone would be making the next day slightly easier by preparing grain, folding cloth, or finishing a record before nightfall. That is how the story often begins, not with thunder, but with attention and routine. Ancient Egyptian food was simple in some ways, and richer in variety than people sometimes expect in others. Bread and beer formed a major part of the daily diet, which can sound spare at first, until you remember how central bread and brewing were to ordinary nutrition and daily life. These were not side items, they were the foundation of the table. Bread was made in many forms, and the process of grinding grain was itself one of those repeated domestic tasks that shaped the rhythm of the day. Grain had to be processed, water added, dough shaped, baked, and shared. That sequence, repeated again and again, gave the household a dependable center. It is easy to think of bread as background, but in a civilization like Egypt, bread was one of the main characters. Beer was equally important, though not always like the beer many people imagine today. It was a staple drink, nutritious and practical, often less about celebration and more about sustenance. Workers may have received beer as part of their compensation. In that sense, beer was woven into the economy of daily life. It could be ordinary, valued, and deeply familiar. The Egyptians ate fruits, vegetables, fish, and sometimes meat, depending on access and circumstance. On the banks of the Nile, fish could be plentiful. In gardens and fields, there were onions, garlic, lentils, beans, and other crops that made meals more varied than the stereotype of bread alone suggests. Honey was prized, sweetening food in a world without modern sugar. Dates were another familiar food, and you can almost picture them as a small, concentrated form of desert sweetness. They would have been useful, portable, and nourishing. Fruit in general must have carried a quiet pleasure, especially when seasons changed and fresh flavors returned. The kitchen world of ancient Egypt was shaped by practicality, but not without care. Cooking methods likely included roasting, boiling, stewing, and baking. Jars, baskets, clay vessels, and flat surfaces all had their place. A household did not need a grand kitchen to feed itself well. It needed good habits, good storage, and enough skill to turn ordinary ingredients into something sustaining. It is also worth remembering that food has social meaning. A meal is never only a meal. It marks family, work, ritual, and hospitality. In ancient Egypt, offerings of food were placed in tombs and temples, reflecting the belief that nourishment had a role in both life and the afterlife. Bread, beer, meat, and fruit could appear not only on the table but in religious spaces too. That repetition is interesting. The same things people needed each day were also the things they wanted to continue in another world. Bread was not just edible, it was symbolic of life itself. Beer was not just drink, it was part of abundance and support. An onion was not just an onion, it belonged to a wider idea of what it meant to be sustained. And because food touches the body so directly, it gives us a softer way into history. We can imagine the texture of bread, the weight of jars, the smell of grain dust, the taste of dates, the sound of water poured into clay. These details do not shout, they settle in gently. Some of the most famous Egyptian images show banquets, and those scenes are useful because they reveal a great deal about social life. People sat, talked, played music, wore jewelry, and enjoyed company. Food could be part of celebration, but also part of status. The arrangement of guests, the serving of dishes, the visibility of abundance, all of these sent messages. At the same time, many people lived much more modestly. A laborer's meal would have looked different from that of an elite household. The contrast is familiar across history, and ancient Egypt was no exception. But even in modest settings, there was order to the process. Someone had to procure, prepare, and divide. Someone had to remember what was needed for tomorrow. It is easy to imagine the pace of food preparation as almost meditative. Grain ground slowly, dough pressed, bread formed, jars carried, fish cleaned, greens arranged, and pots set over heat. There was no rush in the modern sense, only the steady demands of hunger and the discipline of planning ahead. And then there were the tiny practical inventions that make a civilization feel especially alive. Egypt had baskets of many kinds, and basketry is one of those crafts that can disappear from modern attention despite its importance. Baskets carried grain, tools, produce, and more. Their lightness and flexibility made them essential, and yet they were humble, easily overlooked, and deeply useful. Clothing and food were connected too. Linen could be worn while working, but it also had a place in ritual and presentation. Cleanliness mattered, presentation mattered. A person preparing food might also be thinking about the household's appearance, the state of the room, the arrangement of objects, and the cleanliness of vessels. Domestic life was a layered practice. Some of the strangest and most memorable facts about ancient Egypt are not about monuments at all. They are about tiny decisions. How to store grain so it remains safe, how to cool a room, how to wrap something fragile, how to carry water without losing too much, how to dry fabric in the sun without filling it with dust. These are small facts, but they reveal the intelligence of ordinary life. The Egyptians also had access to the river's reeds and papyrus, which touched daily life in more ways than one. Papyrus became writing material, but reeds themselves could be used in many practical contexts. The landscape supplied tools, and people learned to make clever use of what grew nearby. There is something comforting about this kind of resourcefulness. It suggests that ancient life was not only about surviving, but about shaping a livable world from available things. If a civilization is patient enough, it can turn local materials into systems, habits, and beauty. In that sense, the kitchen, the storeroom, and the workshop all belong together. They are quiet engines of civilization. Even the famous tombs and temples rested on the work of people who measured grain, kneaded dough, split reeds, mixed mud brick, and made sure the household continued to function. And because we often associate ancient Egypt with permanence, it is oddly calming to remember how much of it was temporary by design. Bread was eaten, beer was drunk, pots broke, baskets wore out, cloth was washed and reworn. The world renewed itself in ordinary cycles, and people lived inside those cycles with skill. That rhythm can feel very close to bedtime. The day has tasks, and then the tasks end. Food is prepared, eaten, cleared away, and stored. The room grows still. Lamps dim. A family settles. The ancient household, like the modern one, knew the soft ending of an active day. So if we stay with the image of an Egyptian evening, it is not difficult to picture a low table, a few vessels, a loaf broken into pieces, the smell of grain and herbs, and the patient sense that tomorrow would require the same helpful steps again. Repetition in that world was not dull, it was structure, and structure can be a very comforting thing. One of the most curious and beautiful things about ancient Egypt is the way it treated names. A name was not a casual label, it had weight. It had identity. It connected a person to memory and memory to continuation. That is one reason Egyptian writing feels so compelling. Hieroglyphs are often admired for their appearance, but their purpose was much more than decoration. They were signs of presence. They marked ownership, devotion, rank, prayer, and story. A carved name could be a way of staying in the world a little longer. This concern with remembrance helps explain the tombs, inscriptions, and statues that still survive. The Egyptians believed that names and images mattered in the afterlife. If a person's name was spoken, preserved, or renewed, that person remained connected to existence in some meaningful way. So the wall of a tomb was not merely a wall. It was part of a larger act of continuity. When you stand back and think about that idea, it feels both ancient and very familiar. People everywhere want to be remembered. They want their efforts, their family, their face, or their name to endure somehow. Ancient Egypt made that desire visible in stone, paint, and script. The scribes who maintained this world of writing held a special place. To be literate was a rare and powerful skill. Scribes copied records, letters, lists, prayers, and administrative information. Their work was essential. A kingdom of fields and temples still needed someone to keep track of grain, labor, titles, offerings, and events. Writing itself was an act of discipline. It required training, memory, and repeated practice. The signs had to be learned, recognized, and arranged properly. That learning was not simple, which makes the written record all the more remarkable. Every surviving inscription represents hours of study and attention. And because the Egyptians used writing in so many settings, they created a world where words could move between practical and sacred spaces. A list of supplies and a funerary prayer might exist within the same broader culture of script. This gives ancient Egypt a texture that is both administrative and spiritual. The look of the writing also matters to modern viewers. Hieroglyphs invite careful looking. Some signs resemble birds, eyes, reeds, water, snakes, hands, and other recognizable forms. The system feels partly pictorial and partly abstract, like a language that remembers the world it came from. That visual character helped keep writing tied to the landscape and to the things people saw every day. There was also a kind of artistry in inscription. Carving or painting a sign was not only functional, it could be aesthetically balanced, deliberate, and elegant. Egyptian craftsmen often worked with a strong sense of proportion. This is visible in statues, reliefs, and architecture, but it is also visible in the written line. Even a list can be made beautiful when a culture values order. Sometimes the simplest writing objects are the most haunting: a pottery sherd with a note on it, a wooden label, a fragment of papyrus with an inventory. These are small human traces. They suggest someone making a decision, correcting a record, or simply trying to keep life organized. That kind of evidence brings history close. And then there is the constant presence of names on tombs and monuments. The Egyptian elite invested heavily in enduring inscriptions because they believed that preservation was meaningful. A monument could be a machine for memory. It could hold a name against erosion, against silence, against forgetting. This concern even shaped the treatment of enemies and usurpers in some periods. To erase a name was a serious act. To restore a name could also be serious. A name was not merely content, it was a place where identity lived. The result is a civilization that feels unusually talkative across time. The stones may be silent in ordinary ways, but the inscriptions are not. They continue to speak of officials, offerings, titles, gods, rituals, and family relationships. We hear from people who were once ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. A tomb inscription might ask for offerings, a statue base might identify a person, a temple wall might honor a god and a ruler, an administrative papyrus might account for goods and labor. Each one is a different voice in the same long conversation, and perhaps that is one of the most calming truths about ancient Egypt. So much of it was made with the expectation that someone someday might look again. To write is to hope for a reader. To carve a name is to hope for a witness. To preserve a memory is to believe that continuity matters. When evening comes and the house quiets down, the same instinct appears in smaller ways. People label boxes, save photographs, keep letters, remember recipes, repeat family stories, and protect objects that carry meaning. The scale is different, but the motive is not so different at all. Ancient Egypt turns that impulse into stone, linen, and ink. It gives remembrance a physical home. Even the famous transformation of hieroglyphs over time tells a gentle story. Writing systems evolve because human life changes. Scripts become simpler, faster, more practical, or more specialized. The ancient Egyptians did not freeze their language in one perfect form. They adapted as living cultures do. And yet the older forms retained a prestige that lasted for centuries. This is not unusual. Certain styles survive because people feel them to be authoritative, beautiful, or sacred. In Egypt, the carved sign could carry an aura of permanence, while quicker scripts handled the pace of daily administration. So we can imagine a world where one hand writes rapidly on papyrus, another cuts carefully into stone, and a third paints signs on a funerary surface. All of them belong to the same broad civilization, but each serves a different moment in the life of memory. There is something especially restful about thinking of words this way, as objects that can be held, copied, and passed forward. A civilization is not only its rulers, but also its records. And records, when preserved well, can drift gently across thousands of years and still feel alive. That is what ancient Egypt has done. It has carried names forward. Ancient Egyptian religion was not a single simple thing. It was a wide and layered world of gods, local traditions, temple practices, home devotion, cosmic order, and ritual care. It touched daily life in ways that could be formal or intimate, public or private. Temples were among the most visible expressions of that devotion. They were not only places for worship in a modern sense, but also centers of maintenance, storage, ceremony, and authority. A temple was a working institution as well as a sacred one. It needed offerings, keepers, records, and attention. The gods of Egypt are often remembered through statuary and images, and those images are important because they show how the Egyptians imagined divine presence. A god could be associated with a particular animal, symbol, place, or aspect of life. The result was a spiritual landscape full of recognizable shapes. Falcon heads, cat forms, jackals, cows, crocodiles, and other symbols helped people connect the unseen with the known. This can feel strange at first, but it is also deeply human. People everywhere use familiar forms to think about what surpasses them. Ancient Egypt simply did this with remarkable consistency and visual richness. The ritual world was built on repetition, offerings repeated, prayers repeated, festivals repeated. That repetition was not empty, it was how order was renewed. The same action performed correctly and with attention could sustain the balance of the world. This is a powerful idea and also a calming one. There is reassurance in the thought that careful acts matter. Temple reliefs often show offerings, priests, processions, and gods receiving care. These are not scenes of chaos, they are scenes of arrangement. Objects are placed, hands are extended, words are spoken, and roles are followed. Everything seems to have its place. For the ordinary person, religion also lived at home and in the body. Amulets, household shrines, protective imagery, and small devotional objects helped bring sacred care into daily life. A person did not need to stand before a grand temple wall to feel connected to the divine. The sacred could travel with you in a small object, a gesture, or a spoken phrase. And because the Egyptian world was so invested in protection, many of its religious practices feel gently practical. People wanted health, safe travel, fertile land, successful births, and a stable afterlife. Prayer was not separate from living. It was one of the ways living was managed. The idea of the afterlife itself is one of the most famous parts of ancient Egyptian thought, but even there the details are richer than a simple summary. The afterlife was not just a distant reward, it was a continued existence that had to be prepared for carefully. Tombs, spells, mummification, and offerings all work together to support that journey. Mummification, in particular, can feel both strange and profound. It was a highly intentional response to the fragility of the body. The Egyptians invested extraordinary effort in preserving the physical form because body, name, image, and soul were linked in important ways. They did not treat death as a trivial disappearance. There is a softness in that seriousness. The dead were cared for. They were prepared. They were given tools, food, names, words, and symbols for the road ahead. Even when the process seems elaborate to modern eyes, it grew from concern, tenderness, and belief. Tombs were often filled with images of daily life, which is another quietly moving detail. People wanted the afterlife to contain familiar things: food, clothing, music, work, animals, and companionship. Eternity was not imagined as empty. It was imagined as a continuation, complete with the comfort of ordinary life. The famous Egyptian Book of the Dead, though not a single book in the modern sense, reflects this desire to prepare. It is a collection of spells and texts meant to guide and protect. To us, it can look mystical. To the Egyptians, it was a serious and practical map for transition. What makes all this especially interesting is the way religion and state were intertwined. Pharaohs were not merely political leaders, they carried sacred significance as well. Kingship was part of cosmic maintenance. The ruler had duties toward the gods, the land, and the order of society. That does not mean daily life was constantly solemn. Quite the opposite. Festivals could include music, movement, food, and communal feeling. Ritual had room for celebration. Sacred life was not always silent. It could be lively, colorful, and public. The temple economy also reminds us that religion was materially grounded. Offerings had to be produced, clothing had to be supplied, incense had to be burned. Buildings had to be maintained. Priests and workers had responsibilities. Spiritual life depended on a great deal of ordinary labor, and perhaps that is why Egyptian religion feels so enduring in memory. It was not detached from the world. It was built into the world. It touched the river, the grain, the body, the household, the tomb, and the stars. The Egyptians also cared deeply about cosmic order, which widened ritual beyond simple worship. The sky, the seasons, the movement of the sun, and the cycle of life and death all belong to a larger pattern. That pattern could be honored through careful conduct. In this way, religion became a form of attention to reality. When the sun set over the land, and the river darkened, and the temples cast long shadows, one can imagine why the Egyptians felt the need to renew balance through ceremony. The world changed every day, yet it also repeated itself. That combination of change and repetition is at the heart of so much human life. So in ancient Egypt, ritual was not only about mystery, it was about maintenance. The sacred was something you tended. And that idea quietly is very soothing. To tend something, to keep it in order, to repeat what matters, to preserve a name, a body, a field, a home, or a promise. Ancient Egypt built a civilization around that patient work. It is hard to think about ancient Egypt without seeing stone. Temples, statues, obelisks, pyramids, tomb walls, and carved reliefs have shaped the world's imagination for centuries. But stone can sometimes make a civilization look effortless, as if the monuments simply rose out of the desert on their own. They did not. They were made by people, by planning, by labor, and by time. One of the most astonishing things about Egyptian monuments is how strongly they suggest collective effort. A great stone project requires quarrying, hauling, measuring, fitting, and coordination. It asks for leadership, but also for teams of workers whose names may not survive as visibly as the structures they created. That is an important quiet fact. Great monuments often rest on hidden labor. The famous surfaces belong to a much larger human effort. When we admire a carved relief, we are also seeing the weight of tools, the patience of hands, the planning of builders, and the endurance of workers who moved stone through heat and dust. Egyptian architecture was not random grandeur. It followed principles of alignment, symbolism, and function. Temples and tombs often connected earth, sky, and the movement of the sun. This gave the buildings more than one purpose. They were physical structures, but they were also statements about the cosmos. Pyramids, of course, are among the most recognizable monuments in the world. They represent scale, mathematical intention, and an extraordinary investment in the afterlife and royal memory. Yet even the pyramid, enormous as it is, was once a project underway, a surface under construction, a place where stone had to be moved one piece at a time. It can be calming to imagine that process slowly. No need to rush to the finished image. Just the measured steps of workers, the sound of tools, the checking of angles, the repeated effort of lifting and placing. Civilization, in that sense, is built as much through repetition as through inspiration. Statues were also important, and they held a different kind of permanence. A statue could preserve the likeness of a person or deity. It could stand in a temple, a tomb, or a public space and remain present when the living person was gone. There is something deeply human about that desire to have a shape remain after you. Egyptian statuary often presents figures in controlled, dignified poses. This style can feel serene, but it also reflects the value placed on stability and order. A seated figure, a standing figure, a fixed gaze, a clear gesture, all of these communicated a world that wanted composure. And yet, even monumental art was not without warmth. Painted tombs show animals, servants, boats, harvest scenes, music, and family moments. There is a liveliness inside the formal structure. The same culture that aligned its stones with cosmic precision also painted ducks, fish, flowers, and everyday tasks with care. The desert air helped preserve many of these things, which means the dry landscape itself became an accidental ally of memory. What would have decayed elsewhere survived here more often. So in some sense, the Egyptian environment has been preserving conversations for us, one fragment at a time. There are also quieter monumental forms, the kind people do not always discuss first. Tomb chapels, boundary stelae, carved staves, decorated coffins, and small shrines all contributed to the visual and spiritual field of Egypt. Not every monument was a giant pyramid. Some were simply well-made acts of remembrance. The labor of artists and craftsmen deserves slow attention too. Painters, sculptors, carvers, goldworkers, woodworkers, bead makers, and textile workers shaped the appearance of the civilization in ways that can be easy to overlook if we focus only on rulers. A culture is often carried by specialists whose work is both precise and invisible until time reveals it. One of the reasons Egyptian art feels so distinct is that it often balanced convention with clarity. Figures were represented according to established rules, but within those rules there could still be variety, expression, and care. The work was ordered yet not lifeless, and if we think about monuments as messages, they become even more interesting. A temple says something about devotion, a pyramid says something about kingship and eternity, a statue says something about presence, a tomb says something about care for the dead. Stone in Egypt was not neutral, it was meaning made durable. But durability also had limits. Monuments erode, paint fades, names are damaged, sand moves, people reuse stones, alter buildings, or leave them behind. So the permanence that Egypt is known for is real, but it is not absolute. It is a long endurance, not an endless one. That makes the surviving monuments feel even more tender. They are what remain after weather, change, neglect, and time. They are not untouched, they are survivors. The sight of a half-preserved relief or a broken statue can therefore be strangely moving. The fragment still speaks. The missing part becomes part of the story. Ancient Egypt is full of such fragments, and they encourage a gentle kind of looking, where absence is noticed without being rushed past. When the sun strikes a block of sandstone or limestone at an angle, the carved details can seem to emerge and retreat at the same time. That play of light and shadow gives Egyptian stonework a contemplative quality. It asks the viewer to pause, to look, to notice the shape of a line, the edge of a symbol, the posture of a figure. This is one reason Egypt still captivates. The monuments are immense, but the details are intimate. A line of text, a painted eye, a tiny tool, a careful hand. Great civilizations are often remembered through giant forms, but they survive emotionally through small ones. So if we imagine the ancient builders, we should also imagine the quieter moments around the work, the rest between lifts, the water carried to a worker, the count of stones completed, the shared meal, the return home at dusk. The monumental and the ordinary were never truly separate, and perhaps that is the most peaceful way to understand the famous stones of Egypt. They are not only symbols of power, they are also symbols of patience. They tell us that some things are made slowly and that slowness can itself become a kind of wonder. Ancient Egypt had a remarkable relationship with animals. Some animals were sacred, some were symbolic, some were practical, and some were simply part of daily life in fields, homes, and waterways. In all of these roles, animals helped shape how Egyptians understood the world. Cats are among the most familiar examples. They were valued for their usefulness, especially in protecting grain stores from pests, but they also developed a wider symbolic importance. Cats appear in art, names, amulets, and divine associations. They were graceful, watchful, and close to the domestic sphere. It is easy to see why they became so memorable. Birds, too, played a strong role in the Egyptian imagination. The sky was full of movement, and birds lent themselves naturally to ideas of freedom, soul, and divine presence. The falcon, for example, became associated with royal and divine power in certain contexts. The shapes of wings and beaks gave the Egyptians a vocabulary for thinking about reach, speed, and vision. Crocodiles were another important animal, tied to the river's danger as well as its life. Any civilization living beside such a powerful waterway would have understood that the river could nourish and threaten at the same time. Crocodiles carried that dual feeling very well. They belonged to the river, and yet they reminded people that the river was not tame. Dogs, donkeys, cattle, goats, fish, and many other animals also populated Egyptian life. Some worked, some were eaten, some were kept close, some appeared in religious symbolism. The human world was surrounded by animal life, and that closeness shaped both practical and spiritual thought. Amulets are one of the most charming ways to see this. Small protective objects were worn or kept for safety, health, and blessing. They might bear the shape of a scarab, an eye, a god, or another meaningful symbol. In a world where danger could come from illness, travel, childbirth, insects, or the uncertainties of nature, a small object of protection could feel very important. The scarab beetle in particular is one of Egypt's most recognizable symbols. At first glance, it may seem surprising that such a humble creature became so powerful in symbolic life, but the scarab's behavior, especially its rolling of dung, inspired associations with renewal, movement, and the rising sun. Something small, common, and easily missed could become an image of cosmic process. That is one of the most delightful things about Egyptian symbolism. It often elevates the ordinary. A beetle, a reed, an eye, a bird, an ankh-shaped sign, a papyrus stem. These forms are not only decorative, they are ways of noticing the world's patterns. Protective imagery also appears on household items, jewelry, funerary equipment, and temple spaces. The idea of protection was everywhere, but it was not loud. It often lived in the form of a small sign, a carved shape, a pattern on a surface, or an object worn close to the body. There is something reassuring in that. Protection does not always need to be grand. Sometimes it is small enough to carry. Animals in tomb paintings give us another angle on Egyptian feeling. Scenes of hunting, herding, fishing, and domestic life show that animals were not abstract symbols only. They were real presences in a lived environment. People observed how they moved, how they behaved, and how they interacted with the land. The Egyptians also seem to have had a deep appreciation for the symbolic border between human and animal. Gods could have animal features, humans could be shown with animal companions, and certain beings could move between the two realms in thought and art. This flexibility made the visual world of Egypt unusually rich, and because amulets were so common, they also remind us of how ordinary people sought comfort. A protective charm is a quiet expression of hope. It says the world is uncertain, but perhaps not entirely beyond care. It says a small object can matter. It says safety can be invited, not only awaited. That kind of thinking is gentle and deeply human. It crosses centuries easily. People today still carry meaningful tokens, wear certain symbols, keep small objects in pockets, and choose things that help them feel steadier. The form changes, the need remains. If we were walking through an Egyptian market or household, we might notice beads, carved seals, painted figures, woven charms, and animal imagery in many places. These were not random decorations. They were part of the way a person oriented themselves in the world. Even the body itself could be adorned with a sense of protection. Jewelry was beautiful, yes, but it could also have symbolic force. An ornament might signal status, devotion, identity, or blessing. The line between beauty and meaning was often very thin, so the animal world of Egypt was not distant or theoretical. It was close, woven into work, religion, art, and domestic life. A cat on a threshold, a bird overhead, a beetle in the sand, a crocodile in the water. Each one could carry more than one layer of significance, and perhaps that is one of the reasons this civilization still feels so textured. It did not divide the world too neatly. It allowed the visible and the symbolic to overlap. That overlap creates a quiet sense of depth. A small charm can contain a large idea. A common animal can become sacred. A household object can carry hope. A symbol can be both useful and beautiful. Ancient Egypt was very skilled at this kind of layered meaning. As night grows deeper, it is pleasant to imagine those little objects resting in drawers, baskets, cloth wrappings, or on the body itself, keeping watch in their own modest way. They are the kind of details that do not demand attention, and yet they reward it. Of all the subjects associated with ancient Egypt, the afterlife may be the one that most closely resembles a long, thoughtful sleep story. Not because death and sleep are the same, of course, but because both involve passing beyond waking routines into another mode of being, one that invites care, preparation, and trust. The Egyptians treated death with extraordinary seriousness because they believed existence continued in significant ways. This made the body important, the name important, the image important, and the burial process important. The afterlife was not improvised, it was prepared for. Mummification is often the first thing people remember, and with good reason. The process shows how carefully Egyptians tried to preserve the body. Organs were treated with care, wrappings were layered, oils and resins were used, and the entire practice reflected a belief that physical continuity mattered deeply. This can feel strange to modern observers, but it is also a profound act of respect. The dead were not discarded carelessly, they were tended to. Their transition was given time and ritual attention. There is a softness in that, even when the methods seem severe. Burial goods also reveal a great deal about how the Egyptians imagined continued life. People were placed with items they might need or want: food, vessels, jewelry, tools, amulets, images, and texts. The tomb became a provisioned space, a carefully assembled continuation of daily existence. This is one of the most quietly moving aspects of the culture. The afterlife was not imagined as empty abstraction. It was made of familiar things: a loaf of bread, a carved chair, a protective sign, a favorite vessel, a piece of writing, a painted scene of work or pleasure. Eternity, in this view, still contained the comfort of ordinary objects. The Book of the Dead and related funerary texts further demonstrate the idea that the journey after death required guidance. These spells and instructions were part of a larger effort to help the person travel safely and successfully. Protection, knowledge, and correct naming all mattered. Some later traditions imagine the afterlife in sharp moral terms, but Egyptian thought was often more layered and situational. There were tests, judgments, divine forces, and the need for balance. The heart itself became important in this context, tied to conscience, identity, and truth. The famous weighing of the heart scene speaks to this balance. It is a powerful image, but it is also very Egyptian in its emphasis on order. The heart was not just emotion, it was part of the self that had to be measured against truth. And because the tomb was intended as a place of continuity, it often held scenes of life rather than scenes of emptiness. People wanted the deceased to remain in a world that still had movement, nourishment, and pattern. This is why the walls can feel so alive. They are not merely memorials, they are environments. It is also worth remembering that not everyone received the same kind of burial. Social class, wealth, time period, and local custom all influenced the final treatment of the dead. As in life there were differences, yet the broad concern for safe passage and remembrance is remarkably widespread. The body's preservation also reflects an ancient awareness of fragility. A body changes quickly. Climate, insects, decay, and time all act on it. The Egyptians responded with the utmost care, trying to hold back what they could not stop entirely. That effort is both practical and emotional, and the same can be said for the desire to preserve identity. A body may decay, but a name can remain. An image may fade, but it can be copied. A ritual may end, but it can be repeated. Ancient Egypt seems to have understood permanence as something assembled from many smaller forms of endurance. In a bedtime sense, there is something very peaceful about this. The world changes, the body rests, memory continues, names remain in stone, images remain in paint. words remain in text. The Egyptians built a culture that tried to accompany the self beyond visible life, and that effort still feels tender. Tombs are not always dark in the emotional sense. They can be full of color, hospitality, and expectation. They can be prepared spaces, not only endings. This is one reason Egyptian burial culture is so compelling. It turns loss into careful continuation. A long sleep story naturally invites us to think about thresholds, and the Egyptian tomb is a threshold in the strongest sense. It is a doorway between states, attended by ritual, guarded by text, and filled with provisions. But it is also a reminder that human beings have always struggled with absence. They have always wanted to care for the departed, to keep them present in some form, and to soften the distance that death creates. Ancient Egypt did not solve that problem, but it did give it one of the most elaborate and enduring expressions in history. When you picture the sealed tomb, the wrapped body, the written spell, the offered bowl, and the carved name, you are looking at a civilization speaking softly across time, saying that what is loved should be prepared for, and what is prepared for should be remembered. It is easy to let ancient Egypt become too large in the imagination, all pharaohs and pyramids and gods. But a civilization is also made of children, chores, jokes, games, apprentices, errands, and small household dramas. Once you notice that, the world becomes gentler and more believable. Children in ancient Egypt would have grown up around work from an early age, helping where they could, learning skills by observation and repetition. They may have carried water, watched younger siblings, fetched small objects, or assisted with tasks suited to their age. The household was a place of training as much as comfort. Games and play were part of that world too. Board games, toys, dolls, balls, carved pieces, and other recreational objects show that ancient people valued amusement, strategy, and rest. Even in a demanding society, there was room for play. That is a nice fact to hold on to. It keeps history from becoming too stern. Some toys and game pieces discovered from Egypt are charming precisely because they feel familiar. Human beings have always liked to arrange pieces, compete gently, invent rules, and pass time in ways that are both social and absorbing. A game can be a miniature world, orderly and complete. Music and dance also belong to ordinary life and ceremony alike. Instruments, singers, and performers appear in tomb paintings and other art, reminding us that sound was part of the Egyptian atmosphere. A civilization famous for stone was also alive with rhythm. In households, there were probably conversations about weather, supplies, work, gossip, family, neighbors, and plans for tomorrow. We sometimes think ancient life was silent because few of those private exchanges survive, but silence in the record is not the same as silence in life. The rooms were surely full of voices. Work itself was varied. Farmers, builders, potters, brewers, weavers, scribes, fishermen, herders, servants, merchants, priests, and artisans all contributed to the broader society. These roles were not always equal in status, but they all shaped the civilization's daily functioning. The people who made cloth, for instance, were part of a crucial chain. Linen took skill and labor. Spinning and weaving were necessary tasks, and they helped determine how people dressed, stored goods, and prepared offerings. The finished garment might look simple, but the labor behind it was substantial. The same is true of pottery. Jars and vessels are so common in archaeological sites that they can seem almost background, yet they were indispensable. They held food, drink, oils, grain, and other goods. Pottery is one of the most honest witnesses of daily life because it shows up everywhere people lived and worked. Egyptian homes likely contained many of these modest items, along with reed mats, stools, baskets, and storage containers. The furniture may have been simpler than modern furnishings, but it was arranged for actual living. This is a good reminder that comfort has many forms. There were also status differences visible in the home and clothing, of course. Elites had more resources, more access to luxury goods, and more elaborate surroundings. But even luxury in Egypt often came through practical materials and refined craftsmanship rather than pure excess. A well-made chest, a decorated cosmetic jar, a finely woven garment, or a polished mirror could signal both wealth and taste. Daily life also included illness, worry, and uncertainty, though those parts are less visible in the surviving art. People sought remedies, protections, and divine aid, just as people do in every era. Health was never guaranteed. This is why amulets, prayers, and careful living mattered so much. And yet, despite hardship, there is a durable sense of continuity in the record. Families persisted, trades continued, records were kept, the river returned, the seasons changed, children grew, names were inherited. The civilization endured by building habits that could survive disruption. That endurance may be one of the most comforting aspects of Egypt. It was not perfect, but it was persistent. Across centuries, people kept making homes, raising children, measuring grain, writing names, and honoring the dead. History becomes more humane when we see those repetitions clearly. If you imagine a child in ancient Egypt, perhaps sitting near a threshold at dusk, watching older relatives work with reed, cloth, or clay, you can feel the ordinary future gathering around them. They would learn the world through the hands and voices of others. That is how most people always have learned it. And in that simple image, the grand civilization becomes small enough to hold. A family, a room, a day's work ending, a game set aside, a meal prepared, a story told. Those are not minor details. They are the real texture of a civilization that lived long enough to leave such a deep impression. Even now, thousands of years later, the surviving traces invite that same modest attention. A toy, a comb, a brush stroke, a clay pot, a chipped bowl, a small scribbled note. These things do not shout, but they endure. Ancient Egypt was never entirely isolated. It lived at the center of roots, exchanges, diplomacy, conflict, and contact with neighboring lands. That broader world mattered. Goods moved in and out, ideas traveled, and people encountered one another across borders and waterways. Trade brought valuable materials into Egypt, including timber, metals, stone, oils, incense, and other resources that were not always available locally in the same abundance. The movement of goods reminds us that even a civilization so tied to one river was connected to faraway places. Rivers and deserts do not only separate, they also guide movement in specific ways. Foreign contact also shaped taste and technology. Egyptian elites were aware of styles, products, and political realities beyond their own borders. At different times, diplomatic exchange and military conflict both influenced the shape of the kingdom. The world around Egypt was active, not still. That said, one of the most interesting things about ancient Egypt is how distinctly Egyptian it remained even while interacting widely. It absorbed influences, certainly, but it also maintained its own visual language, religious forms, and social structures for long stretches of time. That balance between openness and continuity is quite remarkable. Trade goods likely passed through markets, storage areas, harbors, and administrative systems that required records and oversight. Once again, we see the link between commerce and writing. A civilization that trades widely must also count carefully. The Nile itself made Egypt a connective corridor. Boats and barges could transport heavy materials more efficiently than overland routes. This is one reason the river was so central. It was not just a source of fertility, it was a logistical backbone. Some imported materials were rare and prestigious, used for elite objects or religious items. Others may have entered broader circulation. In either case, the movement of goods tells us that Egyptian life was tied to a much wider map than the local fields might suggest. The borders of Egypt, especially in relation to Nubia to the south and the Levant to the northeast, were regions of contact and exchange. These edges were not empty lines. They were active spaces where goods, armies, envoys, and ideas could move. It is worth noticing that the ancient world did not divide neatly into self-contained civilizations. Instead, It was a network of neighboring societies with long memories and shifting relationships. Ancient Egypt was one of the strongest nodes in that network, and its influence extended far beyond its own land. Foreign objects found in Egypt can be very quiet evidence of this interconnectedness. A piece of jewelry, a timber beam, a style of pottery, a weapon form, or an imported luxury item all suggest movement. History often hides inside the things people carried. At the same time, Egyptian goods traveled outward as well. Its writing, craftsmanship, religious imagery, and administrative practices became known in various forms across neighboring regions and later through the wider ancient Mediterranean world. Cultural influence does not always move in straight lines, but Egypt clearly had a long reach. And because trade depends on trust, negotiation, and timing, it adds another layer of human realism to the story. A merchant had to wait, a caravan had to travel, a ship had to load. A contract had to be remembered, a delivery had to arrive in one piece. Those are humble pressures, but they are the pressures that keep societies moving. Imagine a dockside or river landing at dusk with goods stacked, animals shifting, workers speaking in practical tones, and the last light on the water. The scene would not need to be dramatic to be rich in consequence. That is often how history works. Quiet movements shape large outcomes. And so Egypt appears not as a sealed chamber, but as a civilization in conversation with others. Some exchanges were peaceful, some uneasy, some formal, some opportunistic. The world was broad and Egypt knew it. This broadness does not disturb the bedtime mood. If anything, it helps. A connected world can feel more spacious, more breathable, less trapped inside one moment. Trade routes, river traffic, border cities, and diplomatic exchanges all widen the map in a calming way. You can picture the sand, the boats, the cargo, the travelers, and the paperwork, all moving slowly through the greater pattern of ancient life. And somewhere in the middle of that, a scribe writes down a count, a worker ties a rope, and a vessel continues on its way. Sometimes the most satisfying facts about ancient Egypt are the smallest ones. A civilization becomes vivid when you notice what people touched, wore, stored, and repeated. For example, Egyptian cosmetics were not merely decorative. Eye makeup helped reduce glare and may have had hygienic or protective benefits as well. So a beauty practice was also a practical one. That dual purpose appears often in Egyptian life. Many things were both pleasing and useful. Mirrors, too, had significance. A polished surface can feel luxurious even when the object itself is simple. In a bright, sunlit country, a reflective surface would have been especially striking. The object becomes more than a tool when it catches and returns light. The same is true of jewelry. Gold is famous in Egyptian art, but beads, shells, stones, and other materials also mattered. Jewelry could communicate identity, wealth, protection, and devotion. It sat close to the skin, where its significance would be felt in an intimate way. We can also think about sandals, whose existence reminds us that the body had to be suited to the land. Walking in a hot, dusty environment required adaptation. Footwear was part of civilization just as much as architecture. The ground is always there, and people must walk on it somehow. Another small fact worth holding on to is that many Egyptian objects were made to be durable because life was expected to continue around them. A vessel should hold, a seal should mark, a tool should work, a name should endure. The standard of usefulness was high because the world depended on repeated function. The Egyptians also had household and administrative seals, which helped control goods and identify ownership or authority. A seal is a tiny object with a large role. It can move through a system quietly and leave a mark of trust. That is a very civilized idea, simple and effective. Even the treatment of hair and grooming reveals something about the culture. Wigs, head coverings, and personal care practices varied across time and status, but they show a concern for presentation, comfort, and perhaps cleanliness in a warm climate. How people arranged their bodies was never random. The ancient Egyptian calendar, with its attention to seasons and timekeeping, is another detail that can easily feel abstract until you think about what it meant in daily practice. Knowing when to plant, harvest, repair, celebrate, and prepare was essential. A calendar is a way of being in time with confidence. Then there are the countless fragments of ordinary material culture that survive in museum collections and excavation reports. Needles, pins, ladles, scrapers, bowls, tags, nets, and fibers all contribute to the image of an active, skillful society. None of these are glamorous on their own. Together, they are everything. This is what makes ancient Egypt so rewarding to linger on. It is not only its famous landmarks. It is the texture of objects that fit the hand, objects that solve problems, objects that say very quietly that someone here was living a full life. And there is the matter of color. Egyptian art was not originally the pale, weathered thing that many ruins now suggest. It was painted, bright, patterned, and vivid. Stone surfaces carried pigment. Coffins bore designs. Tomb interiors held color. That means the ancient world was probably more visually alive than the modern surviving fragments often imply. This matters because it changes the mood. The civilization was not only monumental and solemn, it was also bright, decorated, and attentive to surface. Color itself is a form of care. We can also notice the role of smells, which are harder to preserve but important to imagine. Oils, bread, dust, river water, smoke from cooking, incense in temple spaces, and the scent of dry heat all shaped daily experience. A complete picture of Egypt should include the senses. If you put all these small details together, the civilization becomes surprisingly intimate. Makeup, sandals, seals, bread, baskets, wigs, calendars, pigments, tools, and paper like papyrus sheets. These are not abstract symbols. They are the practical and beautiful fabric of a life. And perhaps that is the right tone for bedtime listening. Not the roar of empire, but the careful arrangement of things. The way a civilization is built from details so ordinary that they can be missed unless someone looks slowly. Ancient Egypt rewards slow looking. It rewards patience. It rewards curiosity that does not rush to the final answer. And because of that, it remains one of the world's easiest ancient places to imagine at night, when the mind is ready to settle into quiet, attentive wonder. As we come to the end of our slow visit, it is worth noticing how many different kinds of life fit inside ancient Egypt. There were rulers and workers, scribes and children, priests and farmers, artisans and travelers, households and temples, names and stones, food and ink, ritual and routine. It was a civilization of order but also of adaptation, of permanence but also of daily repetition, of grand monuments but also of small tools and quiet objects that made ordinary life possible. It was a place where the rivers shaped everything, and where people still found time to eat, write, protect, celebrate, remember, and prepare. Maybe that is the most soothing thing about these ancient facts. They show us that even the most famous civilizations were built from patient, familiar acts. A loaf of bread, a mark on papyrus, a careful seal, a painted wall, a name spoken softly, a boat on the river, a room made ready for evening. And now, as the night stays gentle around you, you can let those images drift apart and settle. The river moving slowly, the desert resting at the edge, the temple walls holding their shapes, the household growing still, the names enduring a little longer in stone. Thank you for spending this quiet time with ancient Egypt. May the rest of your night be calm, soft, and easy to slip into. And if we stay with ancient Egypt just a little longer, there are still many small facts waiting in the shadows, the kind that do not ask to be remembered loudly, but do become more interesting the more quietly you hold them. One of the most useful things to know about ancient daily life is that much of it happened in a landscape of careful improvisation. The river did not simply provide food and transport, it also created the conditions for local ingenuity. People learned how to read the land almost as if it were a text. They watched the flood, they noted the soil, they observed birds, weather, and changing banks. In a world without modern forecasts, attention itself was a survival skill. That quiet attentiveness appears in so many parts of Egyptian culture. Even the calendar reflects it. The year was organized around the natural cycle of the Nile, and this meant time was not only abstract. It was seasonal, practical, and deeply connected to the movement of water. Time was something you lived inside, not just something you counted. That can be a comforting thought at night. The world once measured itself by rivers and fields and stars, by things that moved slowly and could be trusted to return. The stars mattered too. Long before modern astronomy, people watched the sky with sustained patience. Certain stars and star groups helped shape religious and practical ideas. The appearance of Sirius, for example, was tied to the annual cycle and the return of the flood. The sky was not empty to the ancient Egyptians. It was a map, a calendar, and a sacred expanse. Night itself may have felt full of signals. There is something especially peaceful in imagining that. A dark riverbank, a cool breeze, a person looking upward and recognizing a familiar star. The same stars above fields, villages, palaces, and tombs. The same sky over the living and the dead. In a civilization that thought so deeply about continuity, that kind of regularity would have felt meaningful. And then there are the tombs, which can seem very serious from a distance, yet often contain strangely human details. Some tomb paintings show banquets, music, agriculture, hunting, and family life. The afterlife was imagined not as a blank silence, but as a continuation of what made existence worthwhile. Food, companionship, work, and memory remained important. Even in the funerary realm, daily life had to be supplied, arranged, and lovingly pictured. Many tombs included offerings in painted or sculpted form because the image itself mattered. A picture of bread could stand in for bread. A painted jar could become part of the eternal provision. This gives ancient Egyptian art a particular kind of seriousness, but also a kind of tenderness. Images were not just decorative, they were active. They helped sustain presence. That belief gives us one more reason to look carefully at surviving objects. A funeral cone, a cosmetic spoon, a wooden figurine, a linen wrap, a scarab amulet, a bowl with a repaired crack, a child's toy, a comb with worn teeth. Any one of these might seem insignificant on its own. Yet each one opens a quiet window into how people manage the ordinary conditions of life: age, illness, beauty, ritual, and memory. Household life in ancient Egypt also reminds us that ancient people often lived among things repaired and reused. Objects were valuable, materials were not endless, wood could be precious, cloth could be reused, containers might be patched or repurposed. A broken item was not always discarded. This creates a different feeling from modern abundance. It suggests a culture of maintenance, where care extended the life of useful things. That sense of maintenance appears in architecture too. Walls were plastered, surfaces painted, canals cleared, storage rooms organized, boundaries marked. So much of civilization is not dramatic invention, but upkeep. An empire can be imagined as a series of regular tasks performed over generations. The quieter those tasks seem, the more essential they often are. Ancient Egypt was also full of written labels and practical notations, which can be easy to overlook because the grand monuments receive so much attention. But writing was used for accounting, administration, property, names, lists, deliveries, and instructions. It served the rhythm of life. Scribes were not only preservers of sacred texts, they were record keepers of grain, labor, and goods. In a way, they were caretakers of memory in its most practical form. It is interesting that so many early writing systems were tied to administration. This suggests that civilization builds its thoughts first around the need to manage complexity. If there are stores, taxes, workers, shipments, and ownership, then marks on clay, stone, or papyrus become necessary. In Egypt, this practical writing eventually became beautiful, ceremonial, and sacred too. A list can become an inscription. An inventory can become a monument. Language itself can cross from the useful into the eternal, and the material that often carried this writing, papyrus, is itself a lovely thought. It was made from a river plant, cut and pressed into sheets. Something that grew in wet places became a surface for thought, memory, and administration. The Nile, in this way, did not only feed the body, it also helped carry language. The ancient Egyptian fascination with preservation extended to the body as well, of course, but even there the topic can be approached gently as a study in care and continuity. Mummification was not merely about fear, it was about maintaining identity across time. The body was treated as something that should remain recognizable, protected, and prepared for what came next. The ritual effort involved priests, materials, and precise steps. It was a very serious answer to the most universal mystery of all. Seen from a distance, that might feel remote, yet the underlying wish is familiar. People wanted their loved ones to remain themselves. They wanted names remembered. They wanted continuity. They wanted some part of a person to survive the final crossing. Ancient Egypt made that longing visible in remarkable detail. The names of gods and the stories about them also reflect this careful relation between order and mystery. Osiris, Isis, Horus, Thoth, Anubis, Ra, Hathor, Bastet, Sekhmet, and many others formed a divine world that touched every level of life. These deities were not abstract. They were involved with kingship, healing, protection, the sun, the moon, writing, motherhood, and the dead. A temple could be both a ritual center and a symbolic map of the universe. And yet Egyptian mythology rarely feels entirely remote, because so many of its themes are quiet and deeply human. Loss, restoration, kingship, succession, protection, jealousy, wisdom, and the effort to maintain balance all appear again and again. The myths often preserve emotional patterns older than any single dynasty. They feel like stories told beside fires, in courts, in shrines, and in households, adapted over time but never losing their core human shape. There is a particular tenderness in the myth of Isis searching for Osiris, gathering the pieces of what was lost, and restoring what can be restored. That story has lasted because it speaks to a deep human wish that broken things might be gathered, named, and made whole again. In the stillness of night, that is not a difficult idea to understand. Egyptian religion also reminds us that ancient spirituality was woven into everyday movement. One did not have to stand in a vast temple to feel part of a sacred order. Daily gestures, protective words, amulets, household rituals, and simple offerings all mattered. The sacred was not isolated from life. It moved through it. A person might wake, wash, eat, work, and pray in a single continuous day, each action touching the next. That merging of the practical and the sacred may help explain why Egyptian art and writing often feel so deliberate. They were not separate from life. They were part of its architecture. Even personal names could carry meaning, invoking gods, virtues, or hoped-for blessings. To be named was to be placed in relation to the larger world. Some of the most interesting quiet facts are the ones that appear at the edges of big history. For example, there were ancient Egyptian labor villages where workers lived in organized communities while building royal tombs. These places reveal family life, meals, complaints, crafts, strikes, and bureaucratic records. They show that even in a state famous for monumental structures, the people involved were still people. They went home, they argued, they recorded shortages, they sought medical care, they worried about supplies, they rested in the shade when they could. That kind of evidence can soften our sense of the ancient past. It becomes less like a frozen gallery and more like a lived neighborhood, with routines, frustrations, and small comforts. A pot of beer, a loaf of bread, a piece of linen, a request scribbled down by someone who was tired. Such details are rarely dramatic, yet they are among the most revealing. Beer, in fact, was a central part of many ancient diets. It was not just a luxury or a festive drink. It was a staple, closely linked to nourishment and labor. Bread and beer were often paired, and both had practical importance in provisioning workers and households. This means the ancient Egyptian table was shaped by the grain economy in a very intimate way. Food was not only about taste, it was about structure, energy, and social life. Bread itself could take many forms, and making it was not always simple. Grinding grain, mixing dough, baking, and storing loaves required time and skill. If a civilization can be partly measured by what it eats every day, then bread deserves its own quiet place in the story of Egypt. It is ordinary, and because of that it is essential. The same is true of garments and cloth. Linen made from flax was one of the defining materials of Egyptian life. It suited the climate, carried social meaning, and appears in many kinds of contexts, from clothing to wrappings to ritual use. The care involved in weaving and laundering linen suggests a culture attentive to texture and cleanliness. White linen especially evokes brightness, order, and freshness. There is something calm in that image, a clean garment in a hot land. A fabric that catches light. Jewelry and ornament also belong to daily and ceremonial life. Gold is often what people remember, but stones, beads, shells, faience, and colored materials mattered too. Amulets were worn for protection or meaning. Necklaces and bracelets could be beautiful, symbolic, or both. Even tiny objects often carried a sense of identity. To wear something was to choose a relationship with the world. It is worth pausing on the idea of faience, because it is one of those materials that feels almost like a small miracle. It was a glazed composition that could be formed into beads, amulets, vessels, and figures. Its blue-green hues suggested water, fertility, and renewal. In the dry brightness of Egypt, a glimmer of cool color would have held special appeal. The material itself seems to belong to the river's imagination. Color in general was not accidental. Egyptians used pigment to bring life to walls, statuary, and objects. Blue, green, red, yellow, black, and white all carried associations and practical uses. A painted eye on a coffin or a statue was not only decorative, it was a sign of presence and protection. The surviving faded surfaces may seem quiet now, but they once belonged to a world much more saturated in visual meaning. This is one reason ruins can be misleading. Stone outlasts color. Time strips away what was once most immediate. A temple today may appear severe, but it was once part of a much fuller sensory field. To imagine the original brightness is to recover some of the civilization's lost warmth. And there are still mysteries. Some inscriptions remain fragmentary, some names are known only in pieces, some tombs were looted long ago, some sites are buried or damaged. Archaeology is a slow art of partial recovery. It gives us enough to wonder, but never quite everything. That incompleteness is not a failure. It is part of the shape of the past. In fact, a partially known civilization can be especially beautiful to think about. The missing pieces encourage humility. We are not standing above history with perfect knowledge. We are listening at a distance, trying to hear through time. Ancient Egypt, despite all its fame, still contains quiet pockets of uncertainty. We know enough to be amazed and not enough to stop asking. There is also the long span of the civilization itself, which can be easy to forget. Ancient Egypt did not last as a single unchanging moment. It stretched across many centuries, with shifts in power, style, religion, and contact with neighboring cultures. Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, later periods, foreign rule, local revival, and transformation followed one another across an immense timeline. The Egypt of one era was not exactly the Egypt of another. That means its history is less like a single solid block and more like a river delta of continuity and change. Certain symbols endured, certain beliefs remained important, but rulers changed, capitals shifted, foreign influences entered, and local traditions adapted. Civilizations live by transformation as much as by preservation. One of the most delicate things to imagine is how ordinary people experience those changes. A farmer might notice a different tax system. A craftsman might receive new materials. A scribe might copy older formulas into a newer age. A family might keep the same prayers, even as officials and dynasties changed around them. This is the quiet persistence that gives ancient history its human scale. Ancient Egypt also sits within a wider world that often moves just softly at the edges of the story. Nubia, the Levant, the Sinai, the Mediterranean, and the deeper African interior all connected to Egypt in different ways through trade, politics, migration, and exchange. The civilization did not exist in isolation. It was part of a network of ancient worlds, each with its own languages, goods, and sacred landscapes. That wider setting matters because it reminds us that ancient places were never sealed off. People crossed borders, brought ideas, traded materials, and learned from neighbors. A scarab found far from Egypt can be a sign of travel and exchange. A style of object can move along with merchants or diplomats. Ancient life was often more connected than we imagine from a distance. Still, despite all these connections, Egypt preserved a strong sense of itself, especially through the Nile Valley's geography. The river gave a clear line to the land, a spine of settlement and movement. Desert on either side created natural boundaries. This is perhaps part of why Egypt could feel both open to the world and distinctly itself. A river can do that. It can connect and define at the same time. There is a special stillness in thinking about the edges of the cultivated land and the dry places beyond. The fields end, the water thins, the sand begins. And in that borderland, so many human meanings gather. Life, scarcity, protection, and the unknown all meet there. Egyptian mythology and funerary thought often reflect that edge between fertility and emptiness, between the ordered world and the wilderness outside it. Even the animals of Egypt carry a kind of quiet symbolism. Cats, crocodiles, ibises, falcons, jackals, cattle, fish, and dogs all appear in religious and everyday contexts. Some were sacred, some were useful. Some were both. The animal world was not separate from human life. It was deeply entangled with it. Watching animals meant watching the world with care. Cats in particular have become almost inseparable from Egypt in the modern imagination, partly because of their long association with domestic life and divine imagery. But beneath the familiar image is something practical and tender. Cats could help with pests. They could become household companions. They could also carry symbolic meanings related to protection and grace. The ancient and the everyday met in that small, poised body. Crocodiles, by contrast, remind us that the Nile was not a tame landscape. The river fed and carried, but it also contained danger. Ancient life was never only idyllic. Water could be life-giving and threatening. Heat could sustain and exhaust. The natural world was close enough to be known, but not so close that it lost its power. That balance of familiarity and risk shaped much of ancient thought. Medical papyri and remedies also show a civilization carefully observing bodies. Some treatments mixed practical observation with symbolic or magical elements. That combination may seem unusual to modern eyes, but it reflects a world in which the physical and the spiritual were not rigidly separated. People tried to help pain, illness, wounds, and discomfort with the tools they had, which included plants, oils, spells, and experience. The desire was simple and universal: relief. In that sense, the medical world of ancient Egypt feels both distant and recognizable. An ailment was an interruption in the harmony of life. A remedy was an attempt to restore balance. The language changed over time, but the underlying care remains understandable. So much of what survives from Egypt is connected to preservation, and preservation itself becomes a theme worth sitting with. Tombs preserved bodies, stone preserved names, dry sand preserved papyrus, temples preserved ritual spaces. Even broken fragments can preserve color, form, and intent. This civilization seems to have been unusually attentive to what should remain, and yet what remains is never complete. We see through gaps, we infer from fragments, we reconstruct households from pottery, professions from titles, beliefs from inscriptions, and habits from scattered tools. Archaeology is like listening to a very old lullaby with missing notes. You can still hear the shape of the melody. Some of the most poignant objects are the ones made for private devotion or personal protection. Small figurines, amulets, inscribed plaques, and household items all show that religion lived at multiple scales. Grand temples and humble charms belong to the same spiritual ecosystem. A person might seek divine favor in a public ceremony and also in a tiny object kept close to the body. Sacred life was layered, intimate, and practical. The ancient Egyptian idea of balance, often linked to order, truth, and cosmic stability, offers another gentle thought for the night. Civilization required balance between flood and drought, labor and rest, life and death, speech and silence, memory and forgetting. The world was understood as something that had to be continually maintained. This is not a harsh idea. It is a patient one. It says that harmony is made, not merely found. That is perhaps why so many Egyptian scenes, even when they depict work, carry a quiet composure. People are shown harvesting, grinding, weaving, carrying, measuring, and offering. These are repetitive actions, but repetition in art can be a form of honoring life. The same motions that sustain a body or a household become worthy of record. And of course, the monumental architecture remains astonishing. Yet even there, one can choose to look softly. A pyramid is not only a feat of engineering. It is also a mountain of intention. A temple is not only stone, it is a setting for ritual continuity. A tomb is not only a burial chamber, it is an effort to keep the dead within a meaningful world. The grandeur is real, but so is the purpose underneath it. When we look at the monuments in this way, they become less intimidating and more human. Someone planned them, someone quarried stone, someone measured, someone carved, someone painted. Someone carried water, food, and tools to the workers. Someone worried about alignment, sequence, and repair. Civilization is not merely a list of wonders, it is a chain of hands. That chain extends all the way to the objects in museums now, sitting very still under soft light. A bead may seem small, a shard of pottery may seem simple, a wooden figurine may be faded, but each one is part of a long conversation across time. The object says quietly that someone was here, someone valued this, someone needed this, someone made this with care. And perhaps that is the lasting charm of ancient Egypt. It allows us to feel both awe and closeness. We can stand before the vastness of dynasties and temples, and then turn and notice a cup, a comb, a rope, a child's game, a loaf shape, a piece of written account, a woven mat, a painted panel, a seal, a reed pen. The civilization becomes not only enormous but intimate. The more patiently we imagine it, the more it reveals itself as a world of homes, courtyards, storerooms, river crossings, workshops, shrines, marketplaces, and gardens. People surely laughed there, worried there, napped there, argued there, told stories there, and went on with their tasks while the sun moved slowly overhead. The grandest ages still contain ordinary afternoons, and as the evening deepens, it may be enough simply to hold that image, the river at dusk, the fields becoming dim, the wall paintings glowing in torchlight, the sounds of work fading, a scribal hand resting for a moment, a basket set down, a door closed gently, a star appearing above the desert edge. Ancient Egypt remains in part because so many of its details were made to endure, but it also remains because our curiosity returns to it again and again, slowly, with patience. We want to know how people lived, what they wore, what they ate, what they feared, what they hoped would outlast them, and how they understood the world around them. The answers are never fully complete, but they are often quietly beautiful. So let the images soften now. The painted wall, the papyrus sheet, the blue bead, the loaf of bread, the river in moonlight, the sealed jar, the carved name, the linen wrap, the temple shadow, the long horizon of sand. Let them become fewer and fewer, until they are only calm impressions moving at the edge of sleep. Ancient Egypt, with all its strange everyday facts, can rest there too, still and bright in the mind for a moment, and then farther away, like a lantern carried down a darkened corridor, its light gentle, diminishing and safe. And there is always more to notice if we stay with the subject a little longer in that quiet way. Ancient Egypt was not a single frozen picture, but a long and changing world that lasted for thousands of years. Dynasties rose and ended, capitals shifted. Temples were built, expanded, neglected, repaired, and built again. The landscape of belief remained familiar, yet the details changed as generations passed. In that sense, it was not one Egypt, but many Egypts, layered one upon another like soft bands of sediment. A person living in the Old Kingdom would not have seen exactly the same country as someone in the New Kingdom. The names of kings changed. The styles of jewelry changed. The shape of pottery changed. Even the written language slowly shifted, like a river altering its course over a long and patient floodplain. And yet some things remained constant enough to feel almost timeless. The river, the harvest, the prayers, the care for the dead, the rhythm of the sun. That sun was everywhere in Egyptian thought. It warmed the fields, marked the hours, and gave shape to the journey of each day. The sun god Ra traveled across the sky by day and through the underworld by night, a magnificent and deeply human image for a world where each evening seems to ask whether light will return. Ancient myth often gives form to that uncertainty. It turns the daily miracle into a story. The sun is not merely there. It sails, it struggles, it is renewed. This blending of practical life and sacred imagination is one of the most quietly fascinating things about ancient Egypt. A tool could be useful and symbolic. A name could be spoken and protected. A tomb could be architectural and spiritual at once. Even a small amulet, no larger than a fingernail, might carry the hope of safety, health, or rebirth. In a culture so attentive to the unseen, objects often seem to rest in more than one world at the same time. Consider the scarab beetle, for example. In everyday life, it was simply an insect moving over the ground, shaping and pushing what it needed. But to the Egyptians, the scarab also suggested transformation and renewal. It became associated with the sun's daily rebirth and with the god Khepri, who was imagined pushing the sun into the sky much as the beetle pushes its ball. It is a remarkable thing, really, to look closely at the natural world and find in it a pattern for the cosmos. A small observation becomes a theology. There is a similar quiet intelligence in the way ancient people understood materials. Gold did not rust, which made it seem almost eternal. Lapis lazuli came from far away, and so it carried distance within it. Turquoise had the color of sky and water. Faience, that bright glazed material, seems to hold a fragment of the Nile's liveliness in its blue-green surface. Ancient artisans did not only make beautiful things, they learned to let substance and meaning meet in the same object. Even the colors in Egyptian art have a kind of calm precision. Blue might suggest the heavens, water, and fertility. Green could suggest growth and regeneration. Black, surprisingly to a modern eye, often carried associations of rich soil and life after inundation, not only darkness. Red might be tied to power, danger, or the desert. White could evoke purity, linen, and sacredness. These are not merely decorative choices, they are a vocabulary of the world. In a painted scene, color does part of the thinking. Writing, too, carried both function and wonder. Hieroglyphs are often admired for their beauty, but they were also a practical system used in many contexts, from monumental inscriptions to religious texts. Their carved forms are so graceful that it is easy to forget they were made to communicate. They name people, announce offerings, record titles, and frame divine speech. Some signs stand for sounds, some for ideas, and some for clarification. The system is patient and layered, like a mind arranging thought into visible form. It must have been an extraordinary thing to learn to write. A scribal education meant long practice, repeated copying, careful memory, and a close relationship with authority and administration. The scribe was in many ways a keeper of order. He measured grain, recorded labor, tracked taxes, noted provisions, and preserved ritual texts. In one of the quieter ironies of ancient life, the people who handled writing could also feel close to power without ever becoming a king. Ink can do much without shining. The tools themselves were humble, a reed pen, a palette. Black ink made from carbon, red from iron oxide or other pigments. papyrus sheets prepared carefully from the plant that grew in the marshy edges of the river. Writing was not a lightning-fast process. It was deliberate. The hand moved, paused, corrected, resumed. The surface received the thought in a measured way. There is something comforting in that slowness, especially before sleep. Papyrus was one of those brilliant everyday materials that seems almost too simple for the importance it held. It became scrolls, records, letters, literary works, spells, and administrative notes. A plant from the riverbanks became a carrier of memory. And memory, in a civilization so concerned with continuity, was never a small matter. To preserve a name was to preserve a presence. To record a transaction was to make the flow of goods legible. To copy a spell was to keep its efficacy alive. Many Egyptian texts were written for practical reasons, but many were also written because people needed reassurance. Funerary spells, guidance for the dead, prayers to gods, and instructions for conduct all reveal a world in which the boundary between this life and the next was carefully tended. The famous so-called Book of the Dead is not a single book in the modern sense, but a collection of spells and formulas assembled over time to help a person navigate the afterlife. Its existence reminds us that people then, as now, wanted comfort when facing uncertainty. The afterlife itself was imagined in remarkably vivid terms. There were gates, guardians, fields, ferries, trials, and transformations. The dead might continue to enjoy bread, beer, and the company of loved ones. They might need protection from disorder, misrecognition, or hunger. Their names had to be spoken. Their bodies had to be preserved or symbolically supported. Death in Egyptian thought was not simple disappearance. It was a passage that required care. Mummification, for all its fame, was not only about preserving a body as an object of curiosity. It was part of a serious and loving cosmology. The body mattered because identity mattered. The person was not only a soul floating away in abstraction. The person had features, a name, a history, and relationships. Preservation was a means of continuity. Even the wrapping itself could be understood as a form of tenderness, however formal and ritualized it might appear to us now. It is easy to see the spectacular side of this tradition and forget the quieter human one. Someone had to prepare the linens, someone had to mix resins and oils, someone had to speak the words, someone had to arrange the amulets. There was craft in it and also grief. Each object in a burial took part in the effort to make absence less absolute. In daily life, the houses of ordinary Egyptians were generally modest compared with temples and tombs, but they were not necessarily bare or joyless. Mud brick homes could be arranged with courtyards, storage spaces, sleeping areas, and work corners. Families likely ate, mended, cooked, and rested in the same general spaces in which they lived. A house in such a world was not a sealed-away refuge from labor, but a small center of life itself. Bread was baked, cloth was woven, children learned, visitors arrived, and the day unfolded room by room. Bread in particular appears everywhere in the record, and with good reason. It was a staple of survival and a shared symbol of nourishment. Ancient Egyptian bread came in many forms, some coarse and some more refined. It could be shaped, flavored, offered, or stored. Beer, too, was closely tied to everyday sustenance. It was not the same as modern beer in taste or strength, but it was a common and nourishing part of the diet. Grain became both bread and drink, and in that transformation there is a quiet domestic alchemy. The agricultural year was shaped by the Nile cycles. When the river rose and flooded the fields, it deposited rich silt. When the waters receded, planting could begin. The rhythm of inundation governed labor, expectation, and perhaps also a sense of cosmic reliability. Even if the flood was not always precisely the same, it was dependable enough to become the anchor of life. Villages and estates watched it closely. A river can be a calendar as well as a waterway. And what a river it was! The Nile is not only a feature of geography but a long corridor of civilization. To travel along it was to move through a world where water, land, and settlement were arranged in a narrow, life-giving pattern. To one side stretched the desert, quiet and immense. To the other were fields, canals, and towns. It is easy to imagine how that contrast shaped the Egyptian sense of order. Life gathered near the river. The margins were vast and largely unyielding. Between them, people cultivated meaning. Desert and river, however, were not opposites only in a simple sense. The desert preserved tombs, it guarded ruins, it created the conditions for burial. It was a place of danger, but also of revelation. Many sacred and royal spaces were set near the edge where cultivated land gave way to wilderness. In that threshold, the Egyptians could imagine a connection between the settled world of humans and the larger, more unpredictable forces around them. Some of the most intriguing everyday facts about ancient life are almost too ordinary to seem extraordinary. Men and women used cosmetics, including kohl around the eyes, not only for beauty, but often as protection from glare and perhaps from irritation. Perfumed oils softened skin and carried pleasant scents. Linen was favored because the climate rewarded light, breathable cloth. Jewelry might be worn by people across social levels, though the materials varied greatly. A small amulet on a cord may have meant as much to the wearer as a crown did to a king, in its own quiet way. Children, too, lived in this world with their own rhythms. They likely learned by observation, imitation, and household work, with formal education reserved more for some than for others. Toys and games are not always easy to preserve, but small figurines, balls, and board games suggest the presence of play. One of the most famous games associated with Egypt is Senet, a board game whose precise rules are still partly uncertain, which only adds to its charm. Games can outlive their explanations. A board with squares and pieces can survive as a trace of afternoons long vanished. It is pleasant to imagine a child reaching across a board, moving a piece and learning patience without ever naming it that way. The same table might later hold bread, a knife, a lamp, and a papyrus roll. Domestic life in ancient times often folded work and leisure together. There was little sharp separation. A room could be both practical and restful, both busy and still. Trade, meanwhile, drew Egypt into a wider world. The civilization did not exist in isolation, even though it often appears self-contained in modern imagination. Goods, materials, and ideas moved in and out over long distances. Cedar wood came from regions beyond the Nile Valley. Precious stones traveled from remote places. Gold, especially from Nubia and nearby lands, played a major role in royal display and funerary wealth. Ships and caravans connected Egypt to neighboring cultures, creating a web of exchange that was ancient even then. These contacts remind us that the ancient world was full of movement. A jar might be imported, a design might be borrowed and adapted, a diplomatic gift might be sent across the desert, a story could travel with a trader, a priest, or a craftsman. Civilization was not sealed, it was porous, curious, and connected. Ideas had a way of crossing frontiers gently, even when armies and politics tried to make them rigid. Some of the most beautiful surviving objects from Egypt are not monumental at all. A comb shaped from ivory or wood, a cosmetic spoon carved in the form of a swimmer or a bird, a small mirror with a polished metal surface, a gaming piece, a bead necklace, a sealed jar, a box for linen. These are the things that make a past world feel inhabited. They are not grand enough to intimidate, but they are intimate enough to invite compassion. A mirror in ancient Egypt would not have shown a flawless modern reflection. Its metal surface would have softened and dimmed the face a little. Still, one can imagine the moment of looking into it. A person arranging hair, adjusting adornment, considering the heat of the day or the formality of an occasion. Even this private act is part of the historical record in a way. Someone wanted to appear carefully in the world. Someone cared about presentation. Someone perhaps simply enjoyed the quiet pleasure of looking. It is easy to forget how much labor was hidden inside beauty. Linen had to be grown, spun, and woven. Beads had to be made or gathered and threaded. Makeup had to be prepared. Perfumes required ingredients, containers, and knowledge. Even a simple robe represented many steps and many hands. What we often see as elegance was, in reality, a small constellation of effort. And yet the Egyptians did not seem to view labor and beauty as opposites. A well-made bowl, a painted chest, a clean garment, a carefully aligned statue, and a neatly written line of text all belonged to the same broad respect for order and form. This order was not only political, it was cosmic. The concept of ma'at, often translated as truth, balance, justice, or rightness, was central to the Egyptian worldview. It was the shape of a world functioning properly, from household peace to divine harmony. Ma'at is one of those ancient ideas that feels larger than any single definition. It was ethical, ritual, political, and natural at once. To live in alignment with Ma'at was to help the world remain coherent. Chaos, by contrast, was not just messiness. It was a threat to the very structure of existence. That seriousness gives a new dimension to ordinary acts like weighing grain, telling the truth, honoring a promise, or keeping a ritual schedule. Such acts were not small at all. They were part of maintaining reality. This may be why the Egyptian imagination is so compelling even now. It suggests that daily life and cosmic order are not separate categories. A courtyard swept clean, a measure taken accurately, a loaf baked properly, a prayer spoken at the right time, a body prepared respectfully, a wall painted in sequence. All of these become meaningful in a universe where nothing is entirely trivial. There were also festivals, and they must have offered a different texture to the year. Religious celebrations could include processions, offerings, music, dancing, incense, and public gathering. A temple image might be carried out among people. The god's presence, or at least the god's story, became more immediate. Festivals linked the community to memory and myth, but also to joy. Even in a culture strongly associated with the tomb, the living clearly celebrated. Music itself is one of those ancient realities that can be felt more than fully reconstructed. Harps, flutes, lutes, percussion, and vocal performance likely shaped ceremonies and private gatherings alike. We can look at wall scenes depicting musicians and dancers, but the actual sound is lost. And perhaps that loss makes the subject feel softer. The instruments remain, but the notes have dissolved. It is like trying to remember a dream with just enough clarity to know it was beautiful. In temple settings, ritual could become highly elaborate. Priests tended statues, offered incense, washed sacred objects, and recited formulas. Temples were not merely large churches in stone. They were believed to be the earthly homes of gods. Their sanctuaries were often restricted, their outer courts more public, their rhythms tied to calendrical and ceremonial obligation. A temple might be busy with administration as well as devotion. Storehouses, workshops, and offices existed beside sacred spaces. Religion and economy were not separate kingdoms. They were closely interwoven. The architecture of these places had its own steady language. Massive pylons, courtyards, hypostyle halls, obelisks, columns shaped like reeds or lotus buds, carved reliefs, painted ceilings, thresholds that led deeper and deeper into dimmer sanctuaries. Walking through such a temple would have been like moving from sunlight into gradual hush. The body would have felt the scale. The noise of the outer world would diminish. One could imagine the cooling air, the smell of incense, the quiet footfall on stone. And then, in contrast, there were the tombs. Tombs could be elaborate or modest, but all were concerned with continuity. The walls of some elite tombs were filled with scenes of everyday life: food preparation, agriculture, fishing, hunting, banquets, workmen at tasks. This was not simply decoration. It was a vision of abundance, a way to ensure that the dead continued to receive what they needed. In a strange and beautiful way, the tomb became a memory palace for life. The famous painted scenes from tombs are often so vivid that they feel almost fresh. A red-brown field worker, a white ox, birds over marshes, grapes being gathered, bread and ducks and jars and flowers. These images preserve not just wealth but attention. They reveal what was worth repeating in the next world. The dead were offered a continuation of pleasant, ordered existence, not merely a silence. Some tombs naturally were plundered long ago. Many objects were removed, dispersed, catalogued, hidden, sold, studied, or lost. This history of excavation and collection has its own complicated story. Ancient Egypt reached modern eyes through layers of discovery, appropriation, and scholarship. Yet even in that later history, there is an echo of the original impulse to preserve. People were still trying in their own imperfect ways to save what time had nearly taken away. The sands themselves helped with that preservation. Dryness can be a kind of mercy to fragile materials. Textiles, wooden items, papyrus, and painted surfaces survived in ways they might not have in wetter places. So much of what we know is owed to climate as much as to human intention. There is something humbling about that. The world kept some things for us and let other things go. And among the things that have come down to us are letters, accounts, and even complaints. These are especially endearing. A record of grain, a note about deliveries, a dispute over missing goods, a message from one person to another, sometimes formal, sometimes plain. Such texts remind us that ancient life was not only solemn and ceremonial, it was also administrative, irritated, affectionate, and practical. Someone was late, someone forgot an item, someone needed to be reminded. The human condition remains consistent across great distances. One can almost smile at the continuity of it. The same species that built pyramids also had to keep track of baskets and barley. The same civilization that imagined divine journeys also dealt with broken tools, delayed shipments, and household needs. Greatness and inconvenience coexist very comfortably in history. There are also the small personal adornments that speak so quietly. A wig carefully arranged may have helped with comfort in heat as much as style. A scented cone, sometimes depicted atop the head in art, may have dissolved slowly and released fragrance. Bracelets, rings, anklets, collars, and earrings appear throughout the record. These details suggest people taking care with how they moved through social space, how they appeared at gatherings, and how they honored themselves and others. The fact that some people wore wigs or shaved for cleanliness or dressed in linen suited to climate shows a civilization attentive to both practicality and image. Ancient people were not distant from bodily life. They were in it fully. They sweated, washed, perfumed, rested, and prepared themselves for the day. There is comfort in remembering that antiquity was lived with bodies, not just with monuments. Food in ancient Egypt was probably simple in many households, but simple does not mean empty. Bread, onions, garlic, dates, fish, beans, figs, grapes, and beer form a picture that is both nourishing and pleasant. Honey was prized. Meat was less common for many people, though available more regularly to some. Kitchen labor would have involved grinding, mixing, cooking over fire, and storing provisions carefully against spoilage and scarcity. A meal was the end result of all that hidden effort. Every bite carried time inside it. Wells, basins, jars, baskets, and storage bins were part of the daily architecture of survival. So was knowledge of seasons, temperatures, and produce. A household needed more than appetite, it needed planning. The ordinary intelligence of ancient domestic life is one of the least flashy but most admirable things about it. Someone knew when to stock, when to preserve, when to bake, when to fetch, when to repair, when to wait. Waiting was important. The river would rise, the crop would ripen, the ritual would come due, the sun would set, the stars would appear. Ancient Egypt, despite its monuments to permanence, was fundamentally a civilization of cycles. Repetition did not mean monotony. It meant reassurance. What returns can be trusted, at least in part. In the sky, the Egyptians watched stars carefully. Timekeeping, navigation, and calendrical observation depended on celestial patterns. Certain stars and constellations had ritual significance. The rising of Sirius, for example, was closely associated with the inundation cycle. A bright point in the sky could become a signal from the cosmos. Night, then, was not emptiness. It was a field of order seen from below. The underworld journey of the sun mirrored the stars' reliable return. It is easy to see why such a people would look up and create stories. The sky was not blank, it was active, it moved with meaning. And because of that, the Egyptians could imagine their own lives as embedded in a larger pattern that stretched beyond the visible horizon. Sometimes the ancient world seems large because of its monuments, and sometimes because of the gaps left behind. We know fragments of names. We know some prayers, but not all. We know some crafts and not every technique. We know some queens vividly and others only faintly. We know towns that flourished and then vanished beneath later layers or the drifting edge of the desert. The incompleteness itself has a kind of stillness to it. It invites patience. There is a particular comfort in unfinished knowledge when one is sleepy. It does not demand resolution. It allows the mind to drift among possibilities. Perhaps a local shrine stood near a canal and was visited with small offerings at dawn. Perhaps a family kept certain charms in a box near the bed. Perhaps a craftsman sang softly while grinding pigment. Perhaps a child watched a boat on the Nile and wondered where it was going. The ancient world becomes human again in these modest conjectures. Even royal life, for all its ceremony, probably contained much that was repetitive and administrative. Kings issued decrees, oversaw projects, maintained relations with temples, and expressed power through ritual. Queens and royal women could hold significant influence in some periods, shaping succession, diplomacy, and religious life. Their stories, when we can trace them, are often intricate and not always fully visible. Yet that uncertainty can be approached gently. Not every figure must be fully known to be deeply present in history. Some names have traveled farther than their original voices ever did. Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Cleopatra. Each belongs to a different moment, a different political reality, a different Egypt. Their legacies have been shaped by archaeology, myth, later storytelling, and modern fascination. But behind the fame there were courts, negotiations, household routines, ceremonies, and private spaces. A ruler too lived within days, and behind every ruler were workers. Quarry workers, boatmen, stone masons, plasterers, painters, farmers, bakers, laundry workers, herdsmen, gardeners, servants, priests, scribes, midwives. The civilization was not made by one hand, but by many, often unnamed. That may be the truest and most humbling fact of all. The visible glory rests on countless invisible efforts. The long endurance of Egyptian civilization also means that it absorbed layers of tradition from very early times. Ideas about burial, divine kingship, sacred geography, and agricultural order were refined over centuries. What appears to us as a stable tradition was in fact the product of patient accumulation. Old forms survived because they remained meaningful. New forms appeared because people adapted. Continuity in this sense was never static, it was maintained. If we listen quietly enough, ancient civilizations can almost be heard breathing through their objects. A jar sealed in a tomb, a brush mark on plaster, a worn threshold in a house, a chipped statue nose, a ring with a name. A model boat placed beside a burial, a little toy animal, a linen strip, a wax seal. Each has its own stillness. Each is evidence of a life lived in ordinary time, and there is something especially calming about a civilization that cared so much about the afterlife while also attending so carefully to daily existence. It suggests that earthly life was not dismissed. On the contrary, it was worth preserving in image, in text, in structure, and in memory. Food was depicted because food mattered. Boats were depicted because travel mattered. Work was depicted because work mattered. The dead were not separated from the living by a blank wall, but by a carefully maintained continuity of meaning. Perhaps that is one reason ancient Egypt continues to feel near even at a great distance. It offers a world in which the everyday is dignified. A linen fold, a loaf, a name, a bead, a jar, a garden pool, a step in a courtyard, a hand reaching for a pen. Such details do not disappear into insignificance. They are preserved because they are worthy of attention. And attention given gently can be restful, so let the image settle once more. The river is moving quietly in the dark, the fields are still. A temple wall holds the last warmth of the day, a scribe's pallet rests near a folded cloth, a painted boat waits in silence, stars rise over the desert edge. Somewhere a name is remembered, somewhere a lamp is set down, somewhere a door is latched. The centuries remain, but they no longer press so hard. Ancient Egypt can continue to linger as a soft arrangement of impressions. Sand, water, linen, stone, ink, gold, blue glaze, warm bread, a patient hand, a sacred word, a sealed chamber, a bright beetle amulet, a carved eye, a distant boat, a quiet hymn, a courtyard at dusk. And then, little by little, even these impressions may begin to fade, not as loss, but as a kind of rest. The old kingdom of thought grows dimmer in the mind, yet remains safe there, woven into sleep like a thin and peaceful thread.